there. Welcome to COVID Primary Sources. My name is Danielle Ofri. I'm the editor-in-chief of Bellevue Literary Review, and I'm joined by Ashley McMullen, who is one of the board members of BLR, and we're so happy to host some of our writers from BLR. And today we're welcoming Shanda McManus and Mallika Sekhar, two of the authors we've published, and we're thinking a lot about the second anniversary of COVID. At this point, it's been 2 years of the pandemic. I think none of us thought that we'd be here at this point, still talking, writing, and grappling about this virus. Everyone here is a physician who's been involved in COVID, and I thought maybe Shanda, you can start us out and maybe get us a little sense of, who you are, how you came to writing, and a bit about what the pandemic was like when you started, and where you are now.
Okay, thank you, Danielle. Thanks for inviting me here. It's just, a pleasure to talk, even though we're still talking about COVID. I'm a family practitioner. I've been in practice over 20 years. I work in a community-based office practice. And, in college, I was an English major, but I never really thought that, I could actually write full time. It was like I took all my med school requirements as my electives. But I was on the medical school track, and I just thought, writing, I just couldn't afford to do it. I needed to go and have a more, established career. So I just put it away and I didn't think about it. And then I found myself, with 5 children, busy, running around practice. And I just kind of a couple years ago said, I want to do a little bit of something just for myself. And so I joined the community writing group. And so that group met once a week, and, we went and wrote little pieces, but I would call myself a casual writer. A lot of times I was writing right before a class because I had a 2 to 3 page piece due, so it was very much like a hobby. And then it's really funny how this coincided with the whole pandemic, because in January 2020, I said, I want to get a little bit more serious. Maybe I could do a book length project. So I joined a novel incubator group thinking, I'll write this fiction story and it'll be kind of low stakes and I'll kind of stretch myself. And all of a sudden we're at March 2020. I work and, it was just the world changed. And I found myself working, we have a satellite office, and the physicians in my practice decided each of us would just work that practice alone. So I was there working solo. We had a shortage of PPE. And, that just makes you kind of reconsider life and everything. And I said, I'm kind of working on this fiction thing, but I have a memoir that I really want to write. So I just totally switched gears and outside of working and COVID and keeping my family together, I have 5 children. I really began to work on my memoir in earnest, and I can say it kind of sustained me. It was like a restorative practice. And my little group of writers, we got together every 2 weeks on Zoom, and it was like my lifeline outside of all the kind of fear and uncertainty that COVID had brought in.
Wow.
Yeah, that resonates so much in terms of, the necessity of writing, especially with something as intense as going through the pandemic. Mallika, I'm actually curious, similar to you, just kind of, introducing yourself, who you are, and kind of, what changed throughout the pandemic and what inspired you to write.
Yeah, so I work as a hematologist in London. So it's a hospital-based job. And so we look after blood diseases, but in this country, we also diagnose. So there's quite a lot of microscopy and so on. So that's been my life. And then when COVID started, I did some trials for COVID using some of the drugs that we use in hematology. And so I was actually in touch with people who were admitted with COVID and who were unwell. And that was really very important. All around, there was an immense energy. That I felt that when COVID started, there was so much worry and fear and people not quite knowing what to do. But there was a tremendous amount of energy and quite focused energy. And just before COVID started, I'd been working on a project on hemophilia and HIV because there was a lot of uncertainty about how to understand HIV in the 1980s. So I was interviewing people, doctors who are now well into retirement across the world, and speaking to them about how they dealt with HIV. And so when COVID started, some of this started resonating with me. And so in many ways, I was actually very interested in understanding a lot of things that were going on, but also being involved in things. So that was pretty much the beginning of COVID. And because I was involved with patients, I would come home and isolate myself rather than mix with my family. And so I was up in the top room with the glass window. And so, I just wrote. I enjoy writing. So I just wrote a lot of random things. And then there was lots of web friends who I would impose these random writings on. So that was how it began. But then in November, when things settled down, and it all looked like it had settled down for keeps before the second wave hit us, the hospital approved my sabbatical, which was like 2 years in the running. So I had a sabbatical of 6 months, which they allowed me to have. And during that period, actually, like Shanda, I had already enrolled into a course on media and medicine at Harvard and another course at Faber on writing. And so I did projects, podcasts, and writings and so on for about 6 months. So I was actually able to focus quite a lot, separate to my work, on writing projects and research. So that's how I got into it. Yeah.
Wow, that's how lucky for you to get a sabbatical. I don't think we're so lucky on this side of the Atlantic, I have to say. Ashley, why don't you tell us about you and how you got into writing and the audio version of writing as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am an internal medicine general internist, similar to you, Danielle. I'm over on the West Coast. I'm on the faculty at UCSF, and I practice primary care at the San Francisco VA. I've always been just a certified bibliophile, like loved books from the beginning. And particularly a lot of your books, Danielle, coming up and recognizing kind of the power of like physicians who are also serve as writers. But for myself, I actually got into it during residency, more as a way of mitigating burnout. I felt that for me, especially doing a primary care track and trying to figure out my place in primary care, it allowed me to like take back some of the time that we're often like boxed into with patients, to like go back and reflect on my experiences and just put them on paper and like kind of wrestle with those emotions. And from there, it was kind of the trajectory into recognizing the power of storytelling and storytelling as a form of advocacy. And the power of sharing our own narratives. So through my work with The Nocturnist, with Emily Silverman, I was able to share part of my story with the last Nocturnist event that happened in January 2020. And then in May, this is, kind of a couple months into the pandemic. And then when George Floyd was murdered, and there was, a huge public reckoning in the United States around racism. That's when we decided to, use The Nocturnist as a storytelling platform to kind of bring in the experiences of Black voices in healthcare. Got to work with my hero, Kimberly Manning, who's an executive producer on the show. And from there, we kind of hit it off and decided to continue this practice of sharing narratives to really shed light not only on our own experiences, but just kind of this interesting and messy and beautiful work of practicing medicine and teaching medicine in the academic setting.
Sure. And for me, I'm also a primary care doctor. I work at Bellevue, which is a big city hospital here in New York, and I'm on the faculty of NYU. And, I started writing after residency. I took off a year and a half to do locum tenens, which is temp work for doctors. And so I traveled around the country working in these small practices, mainly in small towns and in the Southwest and in the Northeast and in Florida. And there was not a whole lot to do in these small towns. And I found myself, I had all these stories from residency that were just sort of bubbling over. And I needed, I don't like the term closure, but I needed a place to put them And so I wanted to put them on paper because I recognize that you'll never be as intense, I think, as you are in residency, as so close to the bone. And for me, training during the HIV epidemic, which felt a lot like COVID, there was just so much to write about. So I just began writing them down to put them somewhere. And then, when I came back, I actually picked up a writing brochure off the street on 2nd Avenue from the Gotham Writers Workshop and started taking writing classes. And I ended up collecting those first ones into a book, but that wasn't my plan. I was MD PhD. I was planning to be a lab, bench researcher. I was not planning to be a writer. And so it definitely opened me up into the idea of serendipity. And then we started Bellevue Literary Review, thinking we wanted to really open this up because this is such a universal experience that really cuts across all walks of life. So it's been interesting. And the pandemic, as for all of us, kind of hit us really blindsided. And I remember starting to kind of keep a diary during the pandemic, just because I remembering how I didn't write things down during residency, which I regretted. And I had a friend training with me, and she was taking notes, and I was thinking, that's really smart. I should do that. But who has the time or the emotional space? But then now, and so I started writing things down now to look back at them, and I ended up putting them together for a piece for the New Yorker. That was this diary. It's really amazing to read back, and because the concept of time I found during the pandemic just completely flattened out, and I still feel as though we've missed a year. 2020 and 2021 feel like one big hellacious year.
Same.
I'd love to see what people think about kind of where we are now, both pandemic wise, but how does our writing, reflect that? And Shanda, are you working on different things now that we're 2 years in?
Yeah, it's really, oh my gosh, it's really interesting because I kind of drafted my memoir in 2020. 2021, I kind of revised it and kind of started a second memoir of a totally different time. And I just kind of completed that in December. And now I'm just kind of like taking a breath and looking, working on smaller pieces, thinking about a third work that actually centers around my time in medical school. It's very dramatic, so we'll wait for that. But it's interesting. I don't know if you've had this experience with, in primary care, how things have evolved during the pandemic. Initially there was just a lot of fear, uncertainty, and then just about, catching COVID, and then that moved to vaccine anxiety and angst, or where can we get it, and should I get it, and then it moved to kind of, you got pulled into these ethical dilemmas. I don't know if you've had this, people want you to write them an exemption that they don't have to wear a mask, that they don't have to get vaccinated. And it's just all this extra load in addition to just seeing, who's well and who's not. And I just feel like, COVID keeps stretching you as a physician. Like my practice, we were short on, medical assistants, receptionists, nurses, and we had a big increase of load of people. We followed all our COVID positive patients like every other day until they were well by phone. So it's just kind of a constantly, I feel like it's a soap opera. Every week when I go in, it's like a different, a different phase of kind of drama that evolves. And I just think as a physicians, we're in a very curious spot, just like ethically, and trying to keep politics out of the exam room. And somehow this has been politicized, and, trying to be an advocate for our patients, even when we disagree with them, and, that whole thing. So I just think there's just so much, even in the beginning of the pandemic, some physicians I knew chose not to practice. And for me and my husband, there was that question on the table. He's also a physician, but he's a radiologist. And, there was a discussion. He said, you're on the front lines. We have 5 kids. Maybe somebody should stay home, So I just think, we've just been challenged, me personally, on so many ways.
I love actually like to stop here and hear the excerpt from the piece that we published in BLR called Breathing. And we did record this for our 20th anniversary celebration. So I want to share this with you, with the audience right now.
June 2020. I rushed to take off the paper and plastic of my full PPE. I've been alternating between my parking lot, evaluating patients for COVID, and my in-office exam room where I'm seeing my regular patients. 3 months into this pandemic, and the questions are still coming. Doctor, how long is this gonna last? Will we get a vaccine? Do masks even work? I am full of the same questions and fears as my patients, but I try to reassure them with a confidence that I don't really feel, since the guidelines and predictions are changing every day. We all want to breathe again without COVID anxiety. I open the door to my exam room and I know that I'm running behind schedule. And I see my patient, a middle-aged white woman, in tears. I hand her the tissue box, which is a practice move for me by now. Since the pandemic started, my exam room has become the cry room. Overwhelmed parents, teachers, and nurses weep openly. It seems like everybody is crying or they want to. I just want to apologize and take responsibility for my role in what's happening in our country, she says. These are not COVID tears, I realize. Under my mask, it becomes a little harder to breathe. I'm reminded again that I'm a Black woman in medicine, a space not meant for me. Shadows of racism and prejudice linger along the edges of my clinical practice. Though no one says, "What are you doing here?" I get comments like, "You look too young to be a doctor," or "I thought you'd be Irish from your name," or "Can I touch your hair?" All physicians protect themselves under veneers during patient interactions, but I think mine's a little thicker than most. It's my special brand of PPE against racism and discrimination. It lets me do my job. But faced with this patient's tears and apology, my veneer cracks a little. Last week, the country witnessed the murder of George Floyd. Black Lives Matter protests are all over the news. Penned by 3 officers with a knee on his neck, Floyd struggled to breathe. His last words were, "I can't breathe." 1 month after surviving COVID, Floyd died from lack of oxygen anyway. I'm caught off guard by this patient. I take a look at her red, splotchy face, and I thank her, but I retreat under my veneer. What I want to say is, don't look to me for forgiveness. Do something. Go to a protest, read a book, widen your circle of friends to include Black people. Is it even my place to offer forgiveness? Is she at fault? I steer the visit back to the easy, her blood pressure, and just try to keep breathing.
Shanda, that was an amazing piece. And I just have to say that we remember, Damon Tweedy, our nonfiction editor, we read this piece, in the slush pile and thought, this is really something, and there's been lots of stories about the early days of the pandemic. And many of them sound very similar. But what sounded different about this one was, there weren't a lot of people out in small practices writing about, it was mostly people in big city hospitals and ICUs, but we didn't really hear the voice of kind of the, kind of practitioner just sort of, by themselves. And I thought that was incredibly, incredibly powerful.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to, just kind of share my experience, because you do feel alone. Like I trained during, the early 90s and HIV, AIDS. It was a big, question, getting needle sticks and, that was a fear, but I was in the big hospital environment. There was a lot of support and a lot of kind of based on what we knew, I felt just kind of more layers of protection. And what I didn't feel that with COVID, especially initially, because we didn't know. I remember thinking about my hair, and I'm just like, oh, well, my hair be covered up, and oh no, now I'm gonna have to wash my hair every night too. So just things like that, So.
Yeah. Shanda, I had to say the part about, deciding whether to start that wash day or not, like hit me really hard. It's a huge factor in the day to day.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, I think now is a good time to actually hear a recording from Mallika's piece that was also published in the BLR, and that's called Distance.
After my father's death, my mother was apprehensive about sleeping alone. She told me that Banu, our daily help, would stay with her some nights. Banu delivered milk to the neighborhood at dawn and cleaned dishes at a dozen homes. She had a milk cart attached to her bicycle, and she worked late into the night. "How will you manage this, Banu?" I asked her on WhatsApp. "And how would the payments work?" "It's Anbuma," she said, using a Tamil word for love. "I don't want money for it." Her words were unexpected and overwhelmed me. Of the many types of love, Anbu is one that's expressed but not spoken of. And for her to spell it out to me, I felt crass. It then struck me that this emotion described what people gave and received through the pandemic. Both my father and the judge were isolated from their families, orphaned, as my mother would say. But they received love from strangers, their doctors, nurses, funeral staff. I take solace in the fact that my family received that anbu, and I can offer that same love to my patients who come to me as strangers. Death of a parent is the diaspora's lurking menace. The call, the rushed exit from work, the first flight back, the omniscient fear of uselessness at the time of need, of not being on time to help or grieve or mourn. It's the expatriate's lot to be distanced, and I had expected no different. But the deep anguish remains. This pandemic has mutated the notion of distance. Every family has been burdened with separation, with permanently incomplete narratives. For me, the need for the physical is overwhelming. My void is not just my father's absence, nor even the inability to feel my mother's touch. It is a fragmented void of dislocation, my family's, my patients', my own. We all feel orphaned. Although the judge's death preceded my father's by a year, in my mind, their deaths are meshed together. Even though the time for sending a card to the judge's family is long gone, I still think of him. I doubt that he would have used the word orphaned. I expect he'd have been true to his pragmatic self all the way to the solitary end. Even with the distance between him and his family, the distance between him and the PPE'd medical teams, I can imagine him examining and perhaps recognizing the love. I only hope that he was able to allow it in, to feel comforted by it, that night of the ambulances and sirens.
Thank you, Mallika. So incredibly moving. My heart, it just breaks in so many places, envisioning having to navigate that from afar. I'm curious, like, what the process was for you in writing that, and kind of, where your work has gone now, 2 years out from the pandemic, and how it's impacted you personally working through that loss.
So when I started my sabbatical, it was quite intense actually, because I was very focused on writing about the hemophilia HIV related issues and making podcasts on those. And so I didn't manage to get to India at a certain time point. And then shortly after that, my father died. And for some months after that, I think I worked on an automatic energy. It sort of carried on. And that lasted for maybe 6 months or so. But after that, I think it took a real hit. My energies took a real hit. Because by that time, there was also all my patients. Like Shanda said, there are so many ethical issues, which for me were both personal and professional. So at work, but also what's happening across the countries. And so I published some pieces in India, for example, about these comparative issues. But also, I was at the front end of, I felt lots of us were at the front end of patients who were angry and mistrustful, which was a new experience for me. Because within the NHS, usually, there's a patient ethos that you sort of get used to. And during the first wave of the pandemic, what was surprising was the number of patients who declined to take part in clinical trials because of mainly of fear. It was a completely new experience for me because in hematology, it's very common for patients to say, "Yeah, I'd like to take part in this trial," and you hardly get a patient declining a trial. So this was completely new. But during the second wave of the pandemic, I experienced patient anger, which still is very, very palpable because so many systems don't work. And just as Shanda said, you deal with each patient as best as you can, but the whole expectations don't match what is actually being delivered. And so there's a huge. So I think 2 years on, personally, I'm still writing, and I have the momentum has fallen a bit, but I am writing 2 or 3 separate things, and so some on the go. And my work commitments have hugely increased now with treatments for COVID. There's lots of COVID-related outpatient treatment clinics, and so lots of us have volunteered to because there's no money to pay for all of that for doctors. So a lot of us volunteer to do that. Yeah. So I think in terms of getting into a groove of a regular work, that the first splurge of energy has now gone into a more stable phase of regular work, I think. It's an interesting mix of having your special personal interests and personal space and time in work-related work.
Yeah. Thank you. It's so interesting. Ashley, what is your sort of observation? You're doing this podcast now and writing 2 years in. Do you feel that things are different now in the way the stories are coming?
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned before kind of like journaling throughout the pandemic and kind of reflecting on where the mindset was at 2 years ago compared to now. And, before it's kind of like, this anticipation of just kind of getting through it. And now it's just kind of realizing like, the evolution and just kind of like that inevitable change. It's like kind of, just this continuation of moving forward. And I think, the stories for me, I think, it just reframes the importance of like humanity and individual identities and kind of meeting people like in the context of their narrative, because there's just so much like judgment and vitriol and misinformation and misunderstanding and miscommunication. And so much like just gets lost in our own agendas. And the stories that we try to tell, at least try to highlight through the podcast, just recognize like we're all just so complex. We're all a product of our experiences, and those experiences are interpreted in different ways, like coming at it from different perspectives. And just taking the time to listen and kind of embody somebody else's space, it just just allows you to breathe a little bit and kind of meet folks where they're at without necessarily like having an agenda or judgment in place first.
Got it.
Yeah, that really resonates because I feel like I don't know about you and your practice, but there's been a huge like spike in anxiety, depression, just emotional upset in my patients. I felt like it was much more on the surface. People were stretched to their breaking point, whether it was moms with kids at homes. I've had teachers in puddles, other healthcare providers, just people are, and some of my older patients, very isolated and lonely. So I felt like COVID really brought a lot of grief to the surface. And, it's funny that, like, what I'm writing about my memoir, deals with grief. So I felt like I was more kind of prepared to receive grief just by being more in touch with my own writing, about that subject. So I think that is something kind of I experienced too.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think, speaking of which, this will be a good time to pause and actually have Danielle read her piece, just also reflecting on kind of how things have changed and how practices have evolved since the pandemic started 2 years ago.
Thanks, Ashley. So this is an excerpt from what started out like 16,000 word piece. And it was so much to write, and I had to get it down to like 4,000 words. This is just one little segment of in the beginning of the pandemic in early April.
Mm.
This is an excerpt from the COVID pandemic diary published in the New Yorker, and it takes place at Bellevue in about the second week of April in 2020, kind of right when things were really out of control in New York City, and we hadn't reached the peak. The thing about a peak is that you only know about it in retrospect. On the way up, it's just an abyss. And on this particular day, I spent the morning in the ICU and then the afternoon in my clinic, which, of course, the clinics had completely stopped. Our patients were scattered far and wide. No one knew if they were okay, if they had their medications. So we were madly trying to reach them by the thousands. Sunshine cascades through the generous windows of the ICU, but the rays seem to flounder once in the rooms. A few glass doors are distinguished by a hastily taped up EKG or a phone number scrawled in black marker. Otherwise, there's a wearying sameness as we make our way around the unit. The patients are all starkly sedated, chemically paralyzed, and mechanically ventilated. They seem entirely without agency. In truth, though, so do we. We set up ventilators, fluids, vasopressors, and the crapshoot antiviral drug of the day, and then stand back and wait. The churn of physiology that will determine the patient's outcomes is shrouded within their unnaturally still bodies, while we watch from behind the glass. Afterward, I hole up in my clinic office to tackle my mountain of phone calls. I've known most of my 1,200 patients for years, a few even since I was an intern at Bellevue. 10 calls in, I decide to check on a woman whose fragile diabetes often flies out of control. She's in her mid-60s, but slim and scampery as a teenager. Last year, though, she'd fallen into a severe depression. She was unrecognizable, lethargic, sobbing, unable to find a reason to live. But her family was dogged, as was her psychiatric team, and toward the end of November, the pall had lifted. 2 months ago, in January, she'd bustled into my office, bright as a freshly tuned violin, her ebullient Spanish galloping faster than my brain could possibly translate. Now, slam dunk success stories like this are rare in primary care, and I was effusive in her chart. Incredible improvement of mood, I'd written. Back to cheerful, happy baseline. Her daughter answers the phone when I call now, and I launch right into my blood sugar queries, but she cuts me off. She tells me that her mother is dead, killed by the coronavirus 3 days ago. My half-spoken insulin question jams in my throat, and I suddenly understand how Houdini must have felt, punched in the gut before he had a chance to clench his muscles.
Incredible. In the time that we have left, I'm just curious, just kind of wondering, what's next for all of us, and I'll start with you, Mallika.
So I've just volunteered for some outpatient COVID work, and I was asking myself, why am I doing this? And because on top of everything else, so the answer is I don't know. I'm now exploring myself in a way that I hadn't previously. I also have my mother thinks I should come and live with her and spend long periods with her. So I'm hoping she decides to come here rather than me go to stay with her. So I'm trying to negotiate that. And but in terms of my writing, I'm really involved in editing a piece of a novel of historic fiction. So that's my present project. And I've done these podcasts, which I've converting into lectures for students, and so that's the major part. So I've got some timelines on these. So I'm quite excited that by the end of this year, I should be producing some tangible work. Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah. Fantastic. And Shanda, what's next for you?
Well, I'm really excited, Mike. The project that I drafted over COVID, I am in the process of actively querying it. So that's exciting. And the second memoir, I'm entering the revision phase. So I plan to revise that through 2022. And I'm starting to draft a third project. And actually, I'm running a memoir incubator. So there's a group of 12 of us, and me and another person are the peer leaders. So we're all drafting together. And so that's been really kind of a nice boost, to have to kind of recreate what I experienced in the incubator and share it with other people. So,
well, only someone with 5 kids could have 3 writing projects going all at once.
Exactly. I was like recalibrating my priorities.
But we want to thank Shanda McManus and Mallika Sekhar for joining us for part 1 of this. And please stay tuned for part 2, Poetry and Fiction. Welcome back, everyone, to part 2 of COVID Primary Sources from Bellevue Literary Review. I'm so happy to be joined by my fellow board member, Ashley McMullen, and now with Benjamin Kessler and Haolun Zhu, a fiction writer and poet, respectively, published in BLR. So welcome. We're so happy to have you. And Benjamin, maybe we'll start with you. Can you tell us a bit about how the pandemic sort of affected you as a writer and how you grappled with that?
Yeah, so I remember it's weird to call the early days of the pandemic since it's been going on so long, but in March, April, May of 2020, when people who weren't considered essential workers or had jobs where they had to be out in the world every day when they were home, I think there was a lot of pressure at the moment, especially if you're on like literary Twitter or something like that, that you should be using that time. Like all the people who talk about, I would pursue my passion projects and pursue my hobbies more were I not at work or something like that, or where I did I not have to commute or something like that. I'd have so much more time to do that. And I think there was a lot of pressure externally and for a lot of people internally as well, sort of this sort of like guilt about not making at that time to create art, to create something meaningful. And someone's like, you should be writing your book. You should be writing your novel. You have this time that you didn't before. You're just inside your house and you're, spending it watching Tiger King or something. And I think that there was a lot of external guilt that manifested in internal guilt in a lot of people. And it wasn't until, that sort of discussion had been going on for a while that people were like, it's okay that you don't. It's okay to not be productive and creative in this time if you're an artist. If you want to, wonderful, seize the reins and do that. But there's something incredibly stressful and unprecedented in a lot of people's lifetimes, especially if you're my age, if you're just entering your 30s. You weren't necessarily at an awareness age where you were able to experience the last major pandemic in its infancy with HIV. And so this is really unprecedented for a lot of people. And it's kind of okay to not put the creative priority first and sort of put just like making do in the world. And so I'm glad that that's kind of fallen away and people are kind of like getting back into the groove of whatever they want to do. But I think in the early days, there was a lot of pressure to write, and there was a lot of pressure for some people to either write about COVID or not write about COVID. Someone's like, well, I refuse to, because it's almost like if I can't see it, it can't see me, and it's going to be over soon, and I don't want it to dominate, my writing, because if COVID occurs, how could you write about anything else almost? Because it's so ubiquitous and so everywhere. And so I think there were a lot of stressors coming from a lot of different places about what you should be doing and how one should be doing it. And I'm glad we're past that point. But in the beginning, it was really hard to foresee writing about anything else for like the near future. You either wrote exclusively about it or you tried to write about anything but it.
Wow. This is such an interesting perspective. And I'm personally glad that you chose to write about it, just because I loved your piece in the BLR. And I'm curious, for you too, Haolun, kind of what your experience was and has been throughout the pandemic, and specifically where you're based, and what was that process like for you preparing to write about it?
I graduated from my bachelor's a month before the pandemic hit New York and Seattle. So I was really surprised by obviously all the different ways things shifted, both physically, economically, as well as just in a spiritual way as to how much grief would be hitting all of us. I hadn't actually published anything before the pandemic. So when I went into lockdown, I started submitting because I've been told there was this thing called Submittable. And that's largely how I joined literary Twitter and online communities. Actually, hilariously enough, before the pandemic and lockdown, I was actually very much a not online person. Like I was up and about all the time. But I found a lot of social catharsis and release through places like Twitter and just like, Tumblr. I went on Tumblr a lot. And I think largely through that, I was also able to find new outlets for writing, because I didn't know about a lot of things like literary journals until the pandemic. So I was able to kind of explore that. In terms of the internal process, I think it's very interesting because I think the New Yorker had like a piece about this, and the New Yorker, which was very fancy, but they had this thing about the time warp, which is so much of the physical elements and dimensions that we were used to before have now completely shifted, and especially during the acute, almost like, the fear and the anxiety in the very beginning in March 2020, it changed everything, and especially for me. And suddenly, I there was this time where my car, I live in New Jersey, and my car, it had like a flat tire, and we couldn't even get like a flat tire, and I was living with my family at the time, and I was just not able to really leave my house for about a week or two, like straight. And at the end of it, when I was walking around, everything felt different. The fact that I processed almost being outside, having the air hit my face, drinking water outside, seeing sunlight, seeing other people. These were all things that physically registered as a new form of stimuli, almost as a shock to my system. And I think a lot of this unpredictability of what I could sense, what I could experience as something that was an incoming, I guess, just like a delivery, and how to respond to that, I think really changed what I was recording in my writing as well. So like ocean air, for example, would have been very different. Anyways, yeah.
That's fascinating. And actually, Benjamin, I was so interested in how you described it being the pandemic. For our previous guests, the four of us were all physicians. And so March and April 2020, there was no boredom, no downtime, no questioning time. In fact, any writing we did was, squeezed in between that. And it's such a different experience of how healthcare workers were writing during the pandemic versus, writers. Maybe you can tell us a bit, what your sort of day job, what you normally do, and then how you came to write the story Admonition.
Yeah, so it's funny. I would have been someone who had a job in March had I not been laid off at the onset of the pandemic, like so many people were. I was marketing at a children's clothing company, and they cut an enormous amount of staff because they had to close their retail locations, and I was an unfortunate victim of that. So I didn't have a job, and I had all this time, and I was just stewing, sort of. My partner had gotten COVID at the very, very beginning of it, and it was really traumatic, and she's still dealing with the long COVID, 2 years out. But I was sitting and stewing, and I saw this photo from China, and it really struck me. It was of people on horseback, medical officials, government officials on horseback in the snow, going to rural parts of China to talk to people about the virus. And it looked like something out of a movie. It looked like something out of Lawrence of Arabia or something like that. It looked very, very old world. And I thought, wow, that's the extent that the Chinese government is is contacting people and interacting with people about the virus. And I thought, well, gosh, we aren't doing that here at all. There are so many communities that are not even 10 miles away from major municipalities or urban areas that get no love from the government in terms of how they interacted with the virus or how they are getting served by the community. And so I thought about how I would interact with that in a story, because I found that idea really compelling about how could I translate an image like that into something that could happen here. And it's like, well, who would be the kind of person who would need to be approached about something like this? Who would we need to go to on horseback, sort of? And it would be people who have decided to live sort of like outside the confines of general society, people who live out in the woods, up in the mountains, out in the desert. And so I sort of landed on, someone being tasked to go talk to someone and interact with them about what's going on, and someone who may be distrustful, rightfully distrustful of the government, and how they'd respond to someone from the government coming and talking to them about this. There's so many examples throughout history of marginalized people being taken advantage of in situations like these. And so I thought it'd be really interesting to see how someone from that audience or someone from living those experiences would interact with something like this, where, the intentions seem good, but they're always going to be waiting for the other shoe to drop. And I thought that would be a really interesting example of something to write out, and something that could be sort of attached with not a lot of sentimentality attached to it, because the person in my story who's approached by a healthcare worker, a public health professional, is sort of, wants to be left alone, has a natural, like a justifiable distrust of authority figures coming onto their property, onto their land, and interacting with them. And I thought that'd be a really interesting way of sort of framing who's getting help and who's not getting help at the moment, and how we can better perhaps serve people like that.
Fiction's often described as the great lie that tells the truth. And I think your story really was prescient in many ways. And so let's now hear an excerpt from Admonition.
The onset of this piece features the narrator, Jennifer Delal, driving up into the Idaho mountains, but on her way to visit Sheila Abercrombie, who she's to give information about the pandemic to, she's stopped by a herd of mountain goats who have blocked her path on the road. I push my glasses up and pinch the bridge of my nose, but then immediately force my hands back onto the steering wheel. Avoid touching your face is the first thing listed on the preventive measures pamphlet I am to give to Sheila Abercrombie. Into her hands, no exceptions, the woman behind the plexiglass at the office told me. She slid a manila envelope across the counter, making sure her fingers were safely back on her keyboard before I took the packet and slotted it into my oversized purse. Her mask, white cloth with purple stars, moved rhythmically as she chewed gum. If she's not there, you go back the next day. And if she's not there again? I asked. Guess. My boss flagged me down on my way out of the office. I moved to sit across from her, but she reminded me to stand in the doorway, to distance. She'd only need a minute, anyway. Do you own a white coat? She asked. Excuse me? Like a doctor's coat. I told her I didn't. We were public health officers, not physicians. Maybe borrow one then. A clipboard, too. Look official. Are we not official? I read the name placard on her desk. Helen Aquiri, MPH, Associate Regional Director. It just helps, especially out in the sticks, and you will be out in the sticks. She told me to log my mileage and instructed me to take a stack of generic Idaho Department of Health and Welfare business cards, since mine wouldn't arrive for another month. The thought of seeing my name, Jennifer Delal, Epidemiologist 1, printed on them terrifies me. Van Dyke texts again, telling me not to accidentally hurt any of the goats. They're protected, he says. Last thing the department needs is more bad press. Recent opinion pieces in the Idaho Statesman have accused us of deadly inaction, citing our slow pace at contacting those often underserved. I could feel the implied severity behind Helena's words. Think of the department. Don't fuck this up.
All right. Excellent. That was incredible. And even better hearing you put your voice to it, Benjamin. I'm curious for you, Haolun, specifically with regards to your piece, House of Endurance. Kind of what was kind of the inspiration behind that, and kind of what you were doing at that time. Similarly, were you working, or kind of what was the day-to-day like for you as that piece came about?
Right. I had graduated, I think, by the time I was writing House of Endurance. I was working I was more like volunteering as an editorial assistant for a specific publication, and I learned a lot through that publication, and that was really great. For House of Endurance, it was a poem I wrote. I think it was around April. I think it was like specifically April or May 2020. And it was like, as I was writing, I remember I was very, very stressed out about the different kinds of physical and emotional constraints and shocks that came with just lockdown. Um, I wanted to write from a place that wanted to capture the different layers and forms of absurdity that form in a lockdown or a pandemic. At first, I think I was almost like tongue in cheek writing in a way that's like, oh, it is about picking a friend up in Seoul. Although I've never been to the city of Seoul, which is more the idea that I had a friend who was kind of like specifically stuck in Seoul at the time, and she couldn't really leave, and she was posting a lot on her Instagram story. And she would have this really intricate makeup ritual that she would do, even though she was double masking at the time. I believe she still is, but the point is, like, no one would see it, and I was kind of I think very touched, or I was very impressed by the different ways we find dignity in such absurd and difficult conditions. And in that, I think that the act of placing makeup on one's face, even though no one's going to see it except for you, and even then, like, the makeup will smear because the mask is quite an intense physical setup. But yeah, so I was thinking about how the many different ways dignity forms, and in the poem, I think at the end, literally, it's about me putting on a Batman costume, but because that's really sometimes, like, that's it, which is through these kinds of measures, we can find ourselves to be armored, to be protected, find a sense of shelter, perhaps.
Yeah, that's so real. Perhaps now is a good time for us to pause again and hear a live reading of your piece, House of Endurance.
She called me to pick her up, but by the time I drove to the block, 3 men in total pandemic suits were walking her out. She thought if she turned her phone off, people couldn't track her temperature. But that's not how they do things in Seoul or anywhere back east. I stood by my car, chuckling, killing me. She had on the teal Maison Margiela and the Eckhouse Lotte belt, full white chiffon, and she even wore the pumps. By the time they got to the ambulance, she was levitating. She told me later they fought with her about wearing contour underneath the face mask. But style is also a necessity. Our mutual religions. She claimed it was for good luck, although it was neither empirically or medically a truism. So daunting a shield as saffron on sandalwood. And it's my turn next week. I'm wearing my Batman costume, with the bulletproof chest plate to cover my heated lungs. I have 06 Halloween candy tucked into my pockets in case I need glucose. The ambulance cheers my name on my way to triumph.
Yeah, thank you, Haolun. That was really wonderful. And it's funny, poetry in some ways flourished during the pandemic because it was really one of the perfect vehicles for social media. It's short, compact. You can pack a lot of imagery and metaphor in a very economical way. And there was a lot of poetry on social media during the pandemic. And I'm wondering, Haolun, if you were at all publishing poetry in social media or reading poetry?
Oh, yeah, I most likely was. I mean, I found both like a form of psychological release, being able to like share with other people and talk to other people. I made a lot of new friends. I feel like I made like one or two very close friends since COVID started, just through Twitter. One is the writer Kwan Tan. I call her Kay, but we never met. She's in Oxford. I think London now. We've never met, but it's really nice. And so, of course, there's the community of writers that have formed through the pandemic. I have no idea what life as a writer was like
Mm.
before because I was mainly just finishing up my bachelor's. I have heard though that there was a huge boom since the pandemic started. I do think the poetry form is very palatable, especially also I think flash fiction and prose poetry when it comes to how it's distributed on social media. I think it's nice. I think sometimes, like Benjamin was saying, it is a bit intense. There is almost like a now industrial pressure to create and to form work. Um, and I think there was quite a lot of literary journals and opportunities to be created during during a situation where everyone was in lockdown and able to really assess what they wanted to do with their talent. And yeah, so yeah, there was definitely a quite a large, I guess you could say, boom. But I also mean that with the double entendre of an economic kind of almost phenomenon happening as well, in terms of an industry.
Actually, have you observed any effect on podcasts during the pandemic, and either the amount or the type of podcasts that have come out since the pandemic has started?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, first of all, I have to admit, I was not an avid podcast listener prior to the pandemic. And then suddenly I find myself, involved in two. But, it's been interesting to see kind of, at least kind of coming in as a bit of a newbie to the podcast scene, just kind of this explosion of different series and voices. And again, this recognition of, this kind of untapped space, this untapped like digital world that, again, just another avenue for people to connect, tell stories, to teach. I think, one of the biggest things I've noticed is just, the medical education community that has come together across the world and been able to learn together through different venues of podcasting. So certainly, along with, I think in many respects, just the opportunity that has come from building more communities and different digital platforms, and podcasting is just one form of that.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And I'm wondering, Benjamin, maybe you can take this one. Do you think that artists and writers have an obligation to grapple with a pandemic like this? Are we required to, as our artistic duty, or can we sort of opt out and say, you know what, not for me, I'll let the doctors and nurses handle this one?
It's so hard because I think it'd be crazy to say that the world hasn't changed. And lots of writers, especially fiction writers, especially people who write autofiction, especially as that grows and grows and grows as a movement, it'd be crazy for them to write a novel about this time, about 2020, 2021, 2022, and not include things about COVID. I haven't seen a single television show that, like a streaming show or a television show or a series that has shown us a person in a mask. And perhaps it's not wanting to bum people out, so to speak, and like provide an escape route. But I think that I don't think authors are obligated to write about COVID or write about life during COVID or make their next novel that takes place during this time have every other line say they said through their mask or something like that, or they talk about when they're getting their booster shot and they show them their vaccination cards and whatnot. I don't think there's an obligation to do that. I think there's plenty of people who are very comfortable doing that, but I don't think everybody has to. And I think that because of the long cycle of which a novel gets published or a piece of work gets published through a major publisher, like a big five publisher, it's this multi-year process. You write something now, it's possible that it's not as prevalent, and we've got a little bit more control over it when that novel gets published. And is someone going to want to read something about such trauma that pretty much the globe collectively, took part in. So I think that authors aren't obligated. I think those that want to write about it should write about it. They shouldn't feel like they can't, or that their work is going to be dated, or that it's going to be sort of this big bummer, or that they're kind of cashing in, so to speak. But I don't think authors are necessarily obligated. I mean, Lingma wrote the COVID novel way before COVID, not way before, but when Severance came out, there's a reason Severance boomed in popularity in 2020, and you couldn't get it from a bookstore anymore. But no, I don't think authors are obligated. And to go with like the literary journal stuff that Haolun was talking about, like they really have exploded, and there's journals now that pop up that are about sort of isolation. Mm-hmm. One that I think of is No Contact Mag in New York City, which when it started as a result of the pandemic and was supposed to be writing about living during COVID. And what does a journal like that do 5 years from now? I think people might see like, it's got this sort of like time bomb on it, that it's going to explode at a certain point. So refuse to be relevant. But some of the themes that we write about during COVID and about COVID are relevant outside of COVID. Things about isolation and things about dealing with trauma and things about how we deal with the unexpected and the incredible shifts in our lives that happen. Like, I'm not going to be interested necessarily in reading a piece about how someone couldn't buy toilet paper, but I'm going to be interested in reading a piece about how someone dealt with like this sort of collective ignorance that a certain percent of the population has towards the pandemic. Mm-hmm. People who are anti-whatever, anti-mask, anti-vax, anti-whatever, how people interacted with that and said, wow, I can't believe that we had this subset, and what it tells me about discourse and what it tells me about how information is spread and how it tells me about trust. So I think the themes that were amplified during the pandemic are going to continue to ripple out. And I think there's a lot of really wonderful earth to till about that. And I think in nonfiction poetry, spoken word, slam poetry, fiction, it's all going to be really, really the fruit's going to be picked from the tree over the next couple of years, and it's going to be really wonderful.
Though I also wonder if we need a certain amount of time, both artistically and as a society, to sort of process a trauma before we can write about it. At BLR after 9/11, we struggled for a long time as when is the appropriate time that it can be part of a plot? Yeah. We received many things that mentioned 9/11. It didn't feel right. It was either too soon or it felt gratuitous, and we needed a certain amount of time. And I remember the first piece we finally published that referred to that. It was very arch. And then, and think about writing about genocides, the Holocaust. I think it takes time both for the people who've experienced it, but also for the artistic process to make sense of it above and beyond just the plot. We all know the story of the pandemic, of being in your mask, being isolated, but you're right, there's more to it. And I think it will be both the historians and the artists who write the book on that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm curious. Maybe I'll toss this to you, Haolun. Similarly, like, how do you feel that at this point in time, COVID has changed the writing community, and maybe kind of where you see yourself going with your work at this point in time?
I feel like I don't really have big plans or and even a general understanding of what I'm going to do next when it comes to my writing. I mean, I did apply to MFAs recently, so there's that. I guess I do often, I guess, wonder where poetry will go, and the directions in which the ways it takes shape as well develops. For example, I think every so often, every few months, I think about different journals and the I suppose also like the rise and falls of certain artistic institutions as well, and how the pandemic, with the way it's afforded certain people a lot more time and energy to see both structural weaknesses and certain people, meaning just anyone really who doesn't have to work full time and has the ability to spend a lot of time looking at certain ways things go about, that I think we'll be able to see a certain rise, I think, of literary journals that I think are a bit more equitable, or have a certain level of care to them that I mean, I celebrate so much institutions that have been around for many years, sometimes decades. Paris Review, I think I recently bought the recent Paris Review, and they've been around since I think the World Wars. But I think it's nice to see that there are journals that are being created right now that speak towards the fact that they were created this decade. And I'd love to pay attention to the fates of them, because I think there's a lot of exciting work being done there, and it's not just fresh. I think it's very, very proactive and attentive towards not just what's happening every week that passes by us in 2022, but also perhaps where we stood in our lives in this century, which I think is quite remarkable.
You know, we interviewed the poet Edward Hirsch for BLR, and he said, literary magazines tell us the news, because we get kind of the first draft of the artistic history there. And I do want to ask Ashley McMullen, our co-host here, to share some of her writing or audio work from her podcast.
The choice to love. A decade ago, on a humid afternoon in Southeast Texas, I was packed into an auditorium with some 200 strangers on the sprawling acres of Camp Allen. It was my medical school's annual Henry Strobel retreat, a storied rite of passage for first-year students in the days before their journeys in medicine. We were invited to meet our new classmates and dissipate some nervous energy through tug-of-war, water slides, and in true Texas fashion, a mechanical bull. The cacophonous chatter in the room suddenly fell silent as Dr. Strobel moved towards the podium. A revered professor of biochemistry and molecular biology who passed in 2019, Dr. Strobel was a man of gentle Southern charm with a humble demeanor. He told us that he was going to share with us the most important lesson we would need to learn in this profession. We all leaned in, anticipating this treasured key to success. Love your patients, he said. I have weighed these 3 unexpected words many times over the years, most recently during a tense phone conversation with a patient during clinic. Mr. Williams, a US military veteran, was not backing down on his demand for a treatment that was not clinically indicated. He was not swayed by my training, my empathic statements, or my recitations of the evidence. Mr. Williams came under my care during the COVID-19 pandemic, when our health system pivoted towards virtual outpatient care. But he struggled with the video technology, so our interactions took place by phone, left only with a disembodied voice, a gravelly Southern drawl punctuated by huffs of frustration and obstinance. I began to fill in the blank pages of his narrative in my mind. I did not love Mr. Williams, and I imagine he did not love me either. In the age of COVID-19, healthcare workers globally have been called to manage the acute wounds of disease on top of the chronic wounds of mistrust, perverse politics, socioeconomic injustice, racial and ethnic animosity, and violence. We struggle to find our own healing as rates of physician burnout and turnover continue to climb. Although the problems are not new, their present difficulties make me reflect on the years to come. How are we equipping the current and future generations of healthcare professionals to deal with the deepening divisions among ourselves, our patients, and society? Perhaps love is a good place to start. During our call, Mr. Williams and I eventually reached an impasse. In the strained silence, he felt defeated and I was burnt out. Fighting the urge to end the consultation, I peered outside at the beckoning blue skies, hovering over the Pacific Ocean, and sighed. Man, it's nice out. Could you tell me what the rest of your day might look like? For the next 15 minutes, I just listened as Mr. Williams offered me a new lens into his life story, a practice we would continue throughout our subsequent phone visits. Over time, this elder adult male smoker with a history of obesity, hyperlipidemia, hypertension, and medication non-adherence evolved into the affable man whose migration to San Francisco did not abate his taste for the buttery seasoned delicacies of the South or a cigarette in the cool evening. He had been fiercely independent his whole life, Yet declining health led to unstable finances and unsatisfactory interactions with doctors who never seemed to listen to him. He found that anger and stubbornness, however, protected him from the pain of feeling unseen. Growing up a Black queer woman, I was well acquainted with the sting of indifference from folks with greater means of power and privilege, but I had not considered how my own coping mechanisms of avoidance and sarcasm may have similar origins to Mr. Williams' obstinacy. As the parallel lines of our stories began to converge, I recalled how my own beloved grandmother often disregarded doctors' advice. She too sought treatments that were not clinically indicated because she felt the doctors never listened. You know, Doc, you and I ain't that different, Mr. Williams chuckled. I even told my family you're the only doctor I trust. It was our first time meeting in person when he agreed to come in for a COVID-19 vaccine. On the surface, he and I could not have been more different. Yet having the competence to absorb and interpret Mr. Williams' story and taking the time to reflect on my own closed the distances between our opposing identities and allowed space for healing on both sides. The choice to love, especially those who are easy to dismiss or disdain, comes with the work of practicing medicine through humility and narrative competence. Love is a revolutionary act. Perhaps in the age of COVID-19, we could use a little revolution in medicine.
Thank you so much, Ashley. It's really, really wonderful. I appreciate that. And we're so thankful you've all been here. Just as we wrap up, Benjamin, what's next for you?
Yeah, probably not a lot more writing about COVID. I've written my COVID story. But I do have a book coming out, a collection of stories in which admonition is included. Thank you. It's set to come out late this year, early next year from Game Over Books, which is an independent press out of Boston, Massachusetts. So I'm very, very excited about that. But yeah, just more writing, working on my third novel at the moment and shopping it around. But yeah, lots and lots of writing. Probably not a lot of writing about COVID.
Haolun, what about you? What do you, more poetry? Are you moving to fiction or nonfiction, or still undecided?
I think I have like probably four poems that I'm working on. I'll probably be done in May or June. They take me a bit of time.
About COVID or other themes?
Right question.
I think it's just in general. But I think nowadays, even if I try not to write about COVID, I'll end up writing about COVID. I have a film coming up. I'm shooting a short film, also in May, in early spring. I want to time it with the bloom time of the Jersey flowers, and I think that's definitely something. Tomorrow I'm going to be going, my two friends who are the assistant director and cinematographer for the short film, we're going to rent out an Airbnb and we're just going to like plan out how we're going to do the scenes and the shot list. It's very exciting. So I'm like, yeah.
Man, that sounds slightly more exciting than going back into the hospital. But I am so thrilled to get to follow up on both of your work. So exciting.
And thank you all for joining us. Benjamin Kessler, Haolun Zhu, my co-host Ashley McMullen. I'm Danielle Ofri from Bellevue Literary Review. Thank you so much for joining us for COVID Primary Sources, and we'll see you at the next event.